Hello, my name is Ana Lopez, and much like this short cow in the tall grass, I am utterly tickled to be here. For the next 15 minutes, I'm going to share with you a recent series of work which explores the intersection of jewelry, the souvenir, place, and identity entitled You Are the Here. But first, some relevant background on me. Here is my 30-second biography. I was born in New York City. Manhattan remains my favorite island. When I was 4, we moved to the suburbs. To my parents' dismay, I was apparently afraid of grass for a while. When I was 10, we moved to Georgia, where I learned the useful and flexible pronoun y'all. When I was 12, we moved to Indiana. When my parents told me it was in the Midwest, I looked for it on the map around Utah. I did my undergraduate work in Ohio under the bright and talented light of Susan Ewing. Then it was back to New York for a year, where I worked in customer service for the self-proclaimed world's largest art supply store. That was interesting. I lived north of Detroit while attending the Cranbrook Academy of Art under the incomparable Gary Griffin. I spent a year rounding out my portfolio as an artist in residence at the Aramont School of Arts and Crafts in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Then it was off to Alamosa, Colorado to teach at Adams State College for 3 years. It was founded as a normal school, meant to provide teacher training to a remote high desert valley. All the art faculty taught 3 subjects, and we actually used phrases like, "I hope the pass is open." Then I decided to get a degree I didn't need for a job I already had, and I moved to Alexandria, Virginia to attend the Smithsonian Institute and Parsons School of Design master's program in the history of American decorative arts. I met a nice guy and moved in with him in DC while I finished the second year of coursework. Then I was hired to teach metalsmithing at the University of North Texas in Denton and eventually came to live in Fort Worth. For those of you keeping track, that is 12 cities in 10 states in 30 years for an average of 1 state every 3 years. The chronology of my memories from this period is tied to and framed by where I was living when they occurred. And then there was Texas. I have lived in Texas now for 12 years, longer than I've ever lived anywhere. Now I have new patterns of behavior, the cycles of the teaching year or election season, and the routines of family life. Which is how this single joint, large diaphragm gas meter came to become a veritable landmark to me. I have passed this approximately 2,000 times while dropping off and picking up my kids from daycare. The sculptural vessel form, punctuated by repeating nuts and bolts on the flanges, as well as the patina of age and use, appeal to me. But the primary reason this gas meter has stood out to me is its amazing backdrop. The local gangs and the city of New York are having a conversation on this wall. The gangs tag it, and the city paints over it. Tag, paint, tag, paint. But the city has a variety of neutral colors in its arsenal, seemingly disposed at random, and this dialogue has created an urban color-filled mural as a result, which functions as a backdrop to my meter. And it is glorious. Now, if there's one thing I learned from the movie Silence of the Lambs, is that we covet what we see every day. And one day, after hundreds of times of passing this gas meter, I stopped and I looked at it and I thought, I want this gas meter to be a necklace. This is fabricated in fine and sterling silver. In general, I began to notice the metallic architectural elements in my surroundings more, largely because they were not changing, because I was not moving. I had also gained some appreciation for industrial metal craft from seeing the small shops that support the auto industry in Detroit. Contemporary metalsmithing has a history in both art craft and industrial craft, the second being frequently overlooked. The shifts in scale, materials, and portability of this piece intrigued me, so I continued the investigation. This shoulder brooch is a replica of my neighbor's attic turbine vent, and in case you are wondering, yes, it spins if you blow on it. To a certain extent, these object types are ubiquitous. Most of the houses in my neighborhood have a vent like this. Many light industrial areas in Fort Worth have large diaphragm gas meters. But through repeated contact, an individual expression of this industrial phenomenon can become familiar and particular. Jewelry of or relating to place has a great history, which I would love to go into with you, but that is a much longer presentation. So, with the idea of everyday landmarks and how they may be superimposed on the body, I wrote a proposal for my development leave in which I would travel to 4 major European cities for 1 week each and, while visiting their holdings of decorative arts objects, try to develop a relationship with the places that I regularly encountered and see what became particular through repeated contact, trying to trigger a reaction such as I had had to the gas meter and the turbine vent. These objects, which became special to me, would then be transformed into precious metals as a kind of souvenir that could be worn to represent the experience of the place and furthermore become transcribed onto another wearer. I visited Paris, France, Dresden, Germany, Vienna, Austria, and London in Great Britain. Not everything from the series has yet been realized. So, what does it mean to transform otherwise banal objects from one's architectural surroundings into miniature replicas presented on the body in precious materials? If these elements come to represent a place, does transcribing them onto a body redefine the identity of that person? First up, Paris. On a side note, allow me to caution you against ever placing your compass against the magnetic closure of your camera bag. The compass doesn't work so well after that, which is why, without a smartphone or a working knowledge of the French language, I found myself stubbornly wandering the streets of Paris looking for my hotel. 3 nights in a row. Each night, exhausted and mad at myself for taking Spanish in high school, I would eventually come across this line of shops and know that I was saved. This is the Viaduct of the Arts in Paris. My hotel was to the east of this. This line of shops was originally the support for an elevated train going east out of the city, but when that line became unnecessary, the top was transformed into a public garden and the arcades were glassed in and handed over to artisans for their workshops. Everything from painted porcelain to handmade parasols are made beneath these arches. But more importantly to me, this arcade came to symbolize the end of my navigational struggles for the day. Thus, they became the first object I was committed to commemorating through reproduction. This is fabricated in sterling silver. One might be tempted to write off these exercises as technical madness or virtuosity for its own sake. However, technical acuity was not the point of this series. It was simply a means to the end. It is important to me to maintain an aspect of realism in this work. According to art critic Linda Nochlin, realism implies a system of values involving close investigation of particulars, a taste for ordinary experiences in a specific time, place, and social context, and an art language that vividly transmits a sense of concreteness. Realism is more than and different from willful virtuosity or the passive reflexivity of the mirror image, however much these may appear as ingredients in the realist works. As realist paintings substitute the image for the object, so does the souvenir supplant the experience being remembered. This is not a metaphorical street. It is much as a real thing as I can make according to my own technical language. Representation of the concrete has historically been eschewed by the upper echelons in favor of the more conceptual sublime as a reflection of the mind-body Cartesian dualism. This is an air diffusion vent mounted inside the roof of a Paris metro train. Please note the angle of this photo, and imagine me nearly flat on my back in the aisle of the train car while the Parisians politely averted their eyes. I've had an undiagnosed vent fetish that goes back more than a decade, so it was no surprise to find myself noticing them in the subway cars. This brooch is fabricated in fine and sterling silver. There seems to be a great deal of abstraction in contemporary jewelry, and abstraction has historically been thought best suited to dealing in generalities and larger abstract concepts. My departure towards the particular and all its tawdry accessibility may seem to be of less importance than those things that do not simply replicate the known. From Paris, it's an easy trip to Versailles to visit the palace that was the home of the Ancien Regime in all its glorious malfeasance. This is part of the back of the Grand Trianon, a minor palace in the complex where Louis XIV could go to get away from it all when the demands of court life became too much. And I found it to have small triangular wall vents. This brooch is cut and carved from a slab of sterling silver. In their study of tourist souvenir types and their symbolic functions, Alain Ducrop and Julie Massette found that most souvenirs fall into the following 4 typologies: the tourist trinket, paper mementos, destination stereotypes, and picked-up objects. It is the tourist trinket, purchased objects featuring the form or likeness of the visited place, that my work is most like. This is the most public and generalized of the 4 souvenir typologies in their study. This kind of souvenir, like jewelry, fulfills a public meaning. It also projects one's belongingness to a subculture of those who travel. Again, one might say that art jewelry does likewise. Both are a form of integration into a recognized subculture based on consumption. Ultimately, the De Cropp and Massett study found that, quote, the sacredness of the souvenir is intrinsically related to the story the individual associates with the object, end quote, which does not necessarily manifest itself to everyone, and I would hardly suppose anyone else to glean the origin of this triangular form when I wear it. Even the protective deterrents at Versailles are gold-leafed. This froth of spikes graces the side of the gated entrance to the Grand Trianon. Both ornamental and defensive, I love the way the barbs seem to cascade down the wall. This multi-finger ring is fabricated from sterling silver with a 22-carat overlay. According to Susan Stewart in her book On Longing, the souvenir both offers a measurement for the normal and authenticates the experience of the viewer. The, quote, capacity of objects to serve as traces of authentic experience is, in fact, exemplified by the souvenir, writes Stewart. They are meant to distinguish experiences that are outside the everyday and domesticate them, to bring them into everyday life back home. One does not generally need or desire souvenirs of places we see all the time, or of easily repeated experiences. This project began to rewire my brain. I saw jewelry everywhere. A street grate in Dresden, jammed with loose gravel, that can alternately be understood as a kind of stone setting. This is partly 3D printed in wax, cast and fabricated silver with backset raw diamond crystals caught in the grate. The act of miniaturization itself has many effects. The unusual scale distances the wear and tear or blemishes seen at life size, as in Gulliver's Travels, how the Lilliputians were perceived to be perfect due to the loss of detail when perceivable as minute. And of course, our bodies are our primary mode of perceiving scale. There's also the relationship of the scale of the piece to that of the wearer. If we all know that a commercial air diffuser is about 2 feet across, and I wear a 2-inch wide one on my body, suddenly I am a veritable giant by comparison. This line of bollards act the part of pawns protecting their king, who happens to be a fire hydrant in Vienna. Or maybe they are rising against him in revolution. The hydrant and bollards are cast. Jen Townsend finally convinced me that I would be insane to try and fabricate these. Small versions of recognizable things became endearing somehow. Psychologist Stanley Hall found that, quote, even feared and hated objects excite pleasure when mimicked on a small scale, end quote. The pattern of relief in this wastewater access point repeatedly caught my eye between my hotel and the museum district in Vienna, and it just seemed made for die forming. And it became another brooch. In addition to the shift in scale, there's the change from public to private space in this series. Each of these inspirational elements reside in the public domain. I'm somewhat turning serial souvenir production on its head in this case. There are potentially many anonymous originals, and only one of each of the souvenir replicas. Pod-like forms also have a special place in my heart. Looking like both an alien, my first cell phone, and a hive for a robot bee, this pole-mounted trash pod delighted me daily in Vienna. Everyday objects, like wastewater covers, become small treasures easily once I went looking for things that might become jewelry. It's similar in the way that tourists, expecting to be odd, develop a kind of pre-nostalgia for a well-known site. I had created the expectation of importance. And lastly, there's the idea of the commemorative object, that these precious portable likenesses may serve as more lasting reminders of their progenitors. The act of memorializing is meant to lend an air of permanence and of lasting importance to an object. Alas, I am sorry to say that not only has the conversation between the gangs and the city of Fort Worth reached an impasse, but my meter was apparently considered too cumbersome for the decreased function of the attached industrial space. Like so many things, it was downsized. And to me at least, these events have rendered this place in the universe invisible once again. The conversation has moved elsewhere, apparently. Although souvenirs are not typically offered for the everyday object or experience, they are often linked with those events whose materiality has escaped us, that exist only through an invention of narrative. Thus has my gas meter become a true souvenir. The objects in the You Are the Here series bear the burden of nostalgia, which will arguably be lost when they're worn or possessed by someone with no personal connection to me or the place represented. But they have had a lasting effect on my psyche, as, even now, I am prone to seeing the architectural details of buildings as potential sources of personal joy. Speaking of personal joy, I would also like to thank the student apprentices who have contributed to my studio practice over the years. Thank you very much.